Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Daniel Kietzer. Daniel leads ecosystem growth at Rheaply, providing strategic organizational and technical support to scale and create new reuse market opportunities between Rheaply clients and partners in select priority regions. He has more than 10 years of experience designing and leading impact-focused circular economy and sustainability programs with forward-thinking companies and organizations across the globe. While reuse and recycling market development is Daniel's specialty, past projects have also targeted social entrepreneurship, sustainability in the built environment, water, carbon, and a variety of other sustainability-related themes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Daniel Kietzer. He's the Director of Ecosystem Growth at Rheaply. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, good morning or afternoon, whatever time it might be where you are.
And hello. Thank you so much for being here and making the time. Please tell us more about yourself.
Yeah. So my name's Daniel Kietzer. I live in Austin, Texas, and have for a while now, 15, 16 years. And I've been working in the sustainability space 2010 or so. And I've always generally been interested in it and kind of living it before that. But yeah, I have a little bit of a specialized background in reuse and recycling and zero waste and kind of that side of sustainability, more of like a circular economy focus. I've also done some projects looking at other forms of carbon reduction and methodologies around how we go about doing that. I've worked with some very large companies. I've worked with some very small companies. I've worked with some cities, and I've kind of fully immersed myself in the space for a little while now.
Yeah, 2010 to 2022. That I feel like, how is it like to have that conversation back then? I feel like even, 5 years ago, sustainability projects was like a harder pitch in many different ways. And how is that in like 2010?
It was very new, and yeah, it's been fascinating to kind of watch that evolution and see, and to just see where the dialogue has gone, especially in more of the kind of corporate sustainability environment. I think back then a lot of the value proposition that sustainability leaders were kind of hinging on, where it was all about how can this create some kind of economic impact? Because if you want to do good for the environment, you also have to make this worth our while as a company. And I think over time that balance has started to shift more and more to, okay, like we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble if we don't clean up our act and do better for the environment. And we're getting better at understanding like what those risks and what those long-term impacts are to not doing the right thing. And that's, I think that's given sustainability folks a little more breathing room and how we operate, and a little more space to be creative.
But yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like, oh, is this like economically, viable to turning into, oh, we're actually destroying our homes. Wait, let's maybe think about it.
Exactly,
Um,
exactly.
so, I mean, I think, to your point, there has been certainly a mindset shift, and of course, policy, incentives, laws, I guess fines also do help that, like in moving the needle. But what are some of the problems you see today that we're experiencing that either needs navigation in order to be able to execute, or some shortcomings that is maybe through structures or technology that we're facing today?
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful to kind of look at this through more of like of the circular economy lens, which is kind of
Yeah.
my focus and what I've been been looking at a lot more recently instead of just kind of broader sustainability. But I think our world today, we're right on the cusp of understanding what circularity means, what it means for business, what it means for people, what it means for us just generally as consumers and people that buy things and own things and throw stuff away. And I think we're still as a society very embedded in that model, that take, make, waste model. And that's really where I see a need for an intervention. That's really where I see a need to get creative and start to understand how we can disrupt that very embedded, very ingrained trend in how we live and how we do business. Instead of taking how do we find stuff that's already been made and reuse, instead of making how do we adapt those things that already exist and to fit our new needs today, and instead of wasting, how do we understand how we plug that back into the beginning of the cycle. And there's so much fascinating work that people are doing in that space now, and I think we just need to make it all a whole lot bigger and go a whole lot faster in how we do it.
Yeah, you touched upon a great point where, makes the problem actually very human. I mean, definitely there's, we can find solutions to it through technology, new materials, but also um, the fact that we are coming from the culture of a throwaway life. And this is literally like, I think it was like don't quote me on it, but it was either a New York Times article or something. Like it was featured as like the glory of throwaway lives. And not
Mhm.
even like 100 years ago, right? It was like 60, 70 years ago. Um, to now, we are very much conscious of what's like happening. Um, but we don't necessarily know what to do about it. Like we started to tackle it, but uh, like on the consumer side, there's a lot of responsibility that we start feeling. We're not sure if we're doing the right thing. On corporate side, we're seeing like efforts, and the 25, 2030 goals are helping for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
But there's a lot of shared responsibility from both, companies and users to really be able to act on this together. So you can't necessarily silo the conversation and like, oh, it's like about setting up a system or an infrastructure or changing the products, but it's also all the human interaction and behavior along the way and how that's impacting the, I guess, life cycle. So I would love to hear, and Rheaply has a very interesting, way of how it started and its journey. I would love to hear more about that because also the way it started was such a human way.
Yeah. So Rheaply as a company, we're on a mission to make the world's resources more discoverable, more easily transferable between parties, and then ultimately more valuable. That's kind of our end objective, and we see that as being and a really integral step to enabling this circular economy to happen and to take place. But we started small, and our origin story is pretty amazing. So our company's founder, Dr. Gary Cooper, an amazing person. He's one of the many reasons that I love getting up and starting work every day. He's so awesome. But he was originally in the lab. He's a neuroscientist, PhD. Was in the kind of lab and research space for quite a while, and he saw firsthand inside of that very small lab environment just a lot of excess resources and a lot of stuff being available that wasn't being used, and if it wasn't being used, was ultimately being thrown away. And so he started putting stuff on a squeaky rolly cart and rolling it around from lab to lab, and sharing those resources and starting to establish that culture of resource sharing just inside of this kind of lab environment. And and I probably still to this day, I think he gets calls from people like, "Oh, hey, where's the card? I need this, I need that." But that was the spark of inspiration that has kind of led us as a company down this very winding path. It was again hinging on what we don't know about, what we don't have visibility into, we waste. And if we can bring visibility into it, we can reuse. We can stop that chain of stuff just going from production to landfill. And so we've gone in so many other really cool directions since then. We do a lot of work in the like large corporate environment space. Any company that owns a whole lot of stuff, we really want to be working with because we can help them manage that stuff a little better, shine some light in some storage closets that haven't seen the light of day in a really long time, and get those things recirculating inside of organizations. But that kind of passion and drive has taken us into some other areas as well, where there's just a whole lot of inefficiencies in operations and a whole lot of waste that's being generated, and built environment being one of those very important critical areas for us, where there's such a big problem, and it's a problem that we as a society absolutely have to solve if we're going to make any kind of measurable change in where we're headed from a climate change perspective, where we're headed from an environmental perspective. And so we're doing a whole lot of work in that area, and then we've got a few other fun projects going on as well.
Nice. I love the evolution and I love how it started too. It's such a like just a good neighbor behavior, like leading to
Uh,
spark an idea in terms of like how do we share better and how do we share at scale, right? And I also really love the approach in terms of like I think there are innovations and technologies around like we have waste, what do we do with it now? How do we repurpose it, recycle it? So there's that angle, but there's also the approach and like how do we get to waste, or why do we get to waste? First of all, is it even waste? Like redefining what waste really means. And I think I can see that journey needs a lot more insights into it regardless of the industry, right? We've
mhm,
just been
mhm.
like our supply chains are so scattered, we don't necessarily have control over it. Production techniques are not necessarily considering like full circle of a product. So it's just aiming to produce and not caring about like what happens when the product use is over. Um, and then there's waste and all the approaches and methods that are trying to address the waste itself. So you said built environment, and not to kind of like this the industry itself, but we also very much know the industry lags in many ways, right? Especially when it comes to maybe conversations around sustainability or equity. um why do you think, well, what are you seeing in the space today that lead that are the like culprit of the waste of the industry?
Yeah, a lot of the stuff. I think
Let's have a list.
yeah, I think fundamentally, yeah, at just the very very beginning of this of all of this, like I think there's a little bit of a disconnect, a little bit of a kind of a mindset disconnect that we see in the built environment in particular around valuing what's already there, and valuing what's already there in our existing built environment that's slowly being torn down and replaced, or torn down and upgraded with something bigger. I One of our kind of mentors here at Rheaply, had she articulated it so well, in that like we go out of our way to buy reusable water bottles. We go out of our way to recycle things in our own personal lives, but we don't recycle buildings. We don't reuse buildings. We don't recycle buildings. You look around, especially in a city like Austin, super fast growing, urban environment where everybody's moving to, hyper popular. We have so much new building going on, and a lot of that new building is happening where there used to be existing buildings, and they're imploded or bulldozed, and they're gone the next day, and something else that's new and shiny and taller goes up in its place. And that motion, going back to those foundations of a linear versus circular economy, that motion starts a pathway that has no other viable destination except for landfill. And that starts a cycle over again of taking, extracting resources, making something new, and then landfilling it. And I think if we don't plan for a dramatic intervention somewhere in between, to say, like, instead of rolling in the bulldozers, let's bring in a highly specialized team that can do some deconstruction, that can salvage some things, that can pull some stuff out. Instead of carting this stuff away in giant roll-off containers that go straight to commingled C&D recycling or to landfill. Let's find end markets. Let's start building demand. Let's start looking for really smart, creative people on the other side that are designing new buildings that we could bring stuff into. And then as we do that, let's frame all of it, every single piece of it, in the context of embodied carbon, and let's start holding ourselves accountable for the stuff that we're building in a way to force us down a path of looking at how to do this better. So I think that for me, like, just fundamentally is part of the mindset that really needs to shift here in this space. Understanding that along the way, there's a whole lot of stuff that we don't know. There's a whole lot of infrastructure that doesn't exist. There's a whole lot of jobs that need to be created in order to make that work and in order to get that process going. So we're going to have to start small. We're going to have to find bite-sized chunks of this to move into. But hopefully, as we start to kind of build this system, that's more of the activity that can start to take place.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big system that is multifaceted, right? And technically every player in the industry have their own challenges around this, and therefore it does call for a grand level of collaboration, which we're not always good at, but we are seeing more and more examples of. You touched upon a few things that I want to highlight. I think what you mentioned around repurposing existing infrastructure and buildings, that definitely doesn't get as much as like the spotlight when we talk about sustainability, right? Like we go to the marketing side of things, like, oh, we have a LEED certificate, which, I'm not undermining their value in any way, but there's also great value in like doing smart renovations for existing built environment in order to be more environmental friendly and not having to just like demo and reconstruct. So I definitely agree with that. And I think to your point too, like the reason why we are even seeing more and more shift in B2C products is the rise of consumer awareness, right? So it's not only about, well, it was first like, okay, we are hurting the environment, we should do something about it. But now actually it became an economic drive for brands and companies too, because the consumers start demanding more as well because of the rise in awareness. That does not exist in built environment, right? Like we don't
Exactly.
necessarily go into when we're buying a home, like, I wonder how this building was constructed and what's going to happen to this building after 50 years. We go in and say, does it have 2 rooms, an extra bathroom? Like that's how we like choose our homes. And I'm
Exactly.
curious to like explore how we raise our collective consciousness in these things. I guess the more information share and the more companies like yourself in the space will lead to that over time. But that's definitely something to think about, and I want to expand on further. And then the last part you mentioned on, being smart about how we are even like constructing in the first place, right? Like if we actually start building in the mindset of well, we're going to actually pull it apart together at some point. So we should construct accordingly, like the car industry, right? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
you can bring pull apart car parts. And so, like, can we do that in buildings, or can we have that mindset thinking this is more of a material bank versus one solid output that we either use it or don't use it? So I think there's like both like really awareness on not only the company side but also consumer side, how we might enable that, as well as just like mindset differences in like how we produce, how we repurpose. I
Hmm.
think are very interesting. It's not that we don't see examples or raise consciousness in this, right? Especially an example I often bring up is like Netherlands, who is like doing a lot of efforts around even like creating like treating buildings as material banks. Create they have conversations around creating building passports. So
Hmm.
there is much more transparency around material use and how it's being constructed. And then one day I was having this conversation with a developer here that I'm not going to give a name of, and I was giving the example of Netherlands, and she said this will never work in US. This would never work in a capitalist. What do
Yeah.
you think on that?
I completely disagree. I just don't. I think we need to get there, and I think we need to be more ambitious in setting that as our mission. Yeah, and everything that you just said is absolutely true. Like there's a mindset shift that needs to happen to celebrate things that are done well and done in the right way. And there's a level of desirability, a level of excitement, a level of connection to history and place, and all of that I think we need to create around these very cutting edge projects, whether around adaptive reuse of entire buildings, around reuse of stuff that's going into buildings, and I think we just need to do a better job at telling and celebrating that story. So that's something that starts to become what's demanded, from owners, from tenants, from people that are occupying buildings. Like I want to see that being a requirement for moving into something, is that you do start to have this narrative and you do start to have these stories, and without it, you face a significant market disadvantage. And I think I don't think we're that far off. When I look around my city, the most memorable, the most interesting, the best feeling buildings are projects where there's been that kind of focus, either entire buildings that have gone through a full adaptive reuse makeover, or specific projects that call back to old memories that I've had here, in town. Those are the attractive projects, and I think we just need to start moving people in that direction to feel those stories, to engage with those stories, in better ways, and building experiences around that. So I think we're getting there. I think we're moving there. We just need a better story to go along with it, and we need people to love that story, and and to want that story, and to demand that story as they're going about their jobs and going about their daily lives.
That's such a good point, and like that's like one of the strongest suits like we have in US, right? It's like storytelling, marketing, building a narrative. We're amazing at these things. We can
Hmm.
definitely, shed light into something that is actually for an urgent need too. And I think what I always assume, at least, like once we are aware, it's not like we can unsee it, right? Like I don't, for example, if I'm looking at this like building to see if I want to live here, if everything is like kind of laid out to me like transparently on how this was done, I mean it's not like if it's something like that would bother me, I don't think I can ignore it. Or could I? Like that's I don't like maybe like in the beginning we don't care much, and over time it's going to become more and more important. It's kind of like,
Hmm.
the energy efficiency of buildings are started to be rated, and you have like an A, B, C in front of like buildings. Like
Hmm.
you can imagine in New York City, there are a lot of C's, right? Do people care? I don't think so, because we don't have the luxury to care, because it's such an expensive city and location very much matters and all of that. But I
Hmm.
think, like, how do we uh create, like, how do we care? And even if we are living in a C building, how do we kind of like show and start expressing our discomfort about it, right? So
Hmm.
in the end,
Hmm.
that's what's happening in other industries, right? People just demanded more, not that there was availability, they just demanded more. So that demand eventually will push, like, maybe the larger developers to um, really shift things, that who would also have influence on policy too,
Hmm.
1000%. So
Hmm.
this would never happen in America. It's kind of like a shortcut answer, to,
Exactly.
like, we don't feel like doing it. um,
Exactly. Exactly.
but also what you mentioned in terms of like desirability, I think it's very interesting. Like I mean, America was the new land, right? And we've been building, but like we have to kind of like get out of that mindset a little bit. Like we don't have, like, yes, of course, new is exciting, new is good, and we should do new. But really valuing what's around us, like in Eastern cultures, right? Like in Japan, wabi sabi, the design trend, really appreciating and honoring the lived experience,
Hmm.
right? You
Hmm.
actually want to have that old, like lived, like vintage feeling to it, because that's valuable. We don't
Exactly.
have that here that much, right? It's like a cultural difference too, where we like the new and shiny and loud and flashy things.
Exactly.
So I guess as we, like, I don't know, over time it's inevitable that we'll move into that direction, right? But like we don't want that to be too far off. And
Uh-huh.
then in desirability, and I'm sure you're seeing this in like companies too, they have, okay, desirability, feasibility, viability. And I'm seeing, sustainability also added there now in like
Hmm.
charts,
Hmm.
which, like, I feel like when it's added separately, it really does act like an afterthought. Like, we did all of these already. How can we make this sustainable? Oh, like this, like maybe, okay, let's do this. But really immersing sustainability into desirability, right?
Hmm.
Merging them
Hmm.
together, that almost, we know this is what we need and what we want. We just have it. So how does that mindset happen, and shift happen? And I know this is a very big question, but as someone who has been in this space for so many years and seeing that mindset shift like slowly too, what do you think like started to enable these changes like over time? And do you feel like one is more powerful over another?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think very slowly as we've been talking about it, I think there is uh, there is a little bit of a culture shift. There is a growing awareness around the impact that our built environment has, and I think we're slowly moving in that direction. Probably today that's more on the operational side of things, energy efficient buildings, buildings that have low water footprints and low water use, things that you can more easily articulate and see as people go about their day to day in the built environment. But I feel like that's also starting to shift a little bit into what's the impact that is carried over, what's the impact that's there from the very beginning with how we with how we went about building this thing or putting this thing together. And and i and i think one of the real enablers for that I've seen, especially over the last couple of years, is starting to kind of find a common language and a common vocabulary around carbon. And I think in a way, carbon and embodied carbon is kind of the great equalizer in a lot of ways, and it does give that common shared measurement to how we're looking at projects, both from an origination standpoint, but then also that kind of longer term operational standpoint. And I really want to see more of that in the narrative, and I want to see people getting more and more familiar with seeing that in the narrative. So
Mm.
so they are looking at buildings, not just from how efficient they are today, how much thought went into to creating them as well. And I think we're slowly starting to move in that direction too.
I love what you said on common language, right? I think, you know, normally so when we talk about all these terminologies or big concepts like climate change, what does that even mean? And it's such a big dump of a responsibility to any user too. Like, what do I do with that, right? As an individual. But once you start defining metrics or creating these like commonalities where people can also connect on and can digest, I think that is something that um, really like increase relatability or understanding and therefore awareness and action, right?
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
why do we see shifts happening faster in, let's say, maybe the food industry? Because it's relatable, it's part of our day to day, we connect with it all the
mhm,
time.
mhm,
Why do we see fashion, maybe like first it was all just like marketing, but now really taking act on it? Like why do we see a lot more initiatives in fashion? Because it's also very much of a common thread in our lives, right? Like it's very relatable and we feel more responsible for it too as we know
mhm.
more. So in terms of like how do we bring more access into what's really happening? Um, like common language, to your point, is definitely one way of like doing that. How do you think we can also make these conversations more relatable and more part of our like day to day?
Yeah, another great question. I think in addition to the common language, going back to something that we were talking about previously as well, is the storytelling around this. Yeah, and one of the things that we're looking at Rheaply is how do we start to tell that narrative of where something came from and connect those dots to where something is now. And I think there's something really powerful in that story that I would love to showcase more, that I would love to have people interact with. Like if we're in a building and there's elements of that building that were
Mm.
reused, I want people to be able to go up and see that and read that, or interact with it on their phone or with their mobile device, to start to understand that what they're experiencing has a better narrative behind it. And I think in that it's in that kind of storytelling element that we really start to see this emerge as a competitive advantage. In a lot of ways, it's competitive now because it's not standard practice, but I think over time that's how we start to get this more and more into that kind of desirability, the thing that people are like looking for or yearning for in their day-to-day experiences. And I want it to be really obvious when that's missing.
Mm.
And I want people to kind of yearn for that feeling.
That's yeah, that's such a great point because, it's not like we were born with these habits or expectations, right? Like all of this was part of some storytelling at some point that really maybe like brainwashed us in so many
Hmm.
different ways too. Like we don't what we see what to expect from a high-end residential living or a public space or the lifestyle we should be living, like everything, like storytelling, advertising, campaign, like all of that has so much influence in building these perceptions. And to your
Hmm.
point, like how do we make like sustainability desirable, sexy in so many ways that these things were like presented to us at times so that that demand and awareness starts. And, knowing that also, like maybe in the beginning we still don't have full understanding, we just hear about it and we're like, oh, I want that too, what's happening there.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
but that could only result in uh you know, like a more collective understanding of what's happening and therefore action. um, so I mean, these things we're talking about, like storytelling, building the language, like they take, and you've experienced this yourself, like almost generations in like
Hmm.
starting seeing the impact, right? So I want to also like us to be aware of like the urgency of the situation at the present, right? Like I don't think the environmental crises that we're experiencing are not getting as much as a spotlight like a global health crisis did, right? But it's
Hmm.
all equivalently maybe important, and we're not talking about that enough. So with all these like urgencies around like also considering what's going to happen to the world in 2050, 2060, what are some solutions that you think we need to think about more, maybe both top down and bottom up, right? To like expedite action and the mindset shift, those things that can take time, but how do we create quick interventions that could result in them more sustainable solutions?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think the bottom up, the kind of cultural shifts, some of the behavior change, some of the ways that we as society, yeah, interact with and engage with these problems. Like you're absolutely right. That takes a lot of time. But I think that the top down can go a little faster. And I
Mm,
feel like we're kind of uh, we're in a really interesting place with a lot of conversations around policy, a lot of conversations around kind of enabling these systems to start to take place from from kind of a government legislative perspective, but also from a business perspective. I think we're starting to see a whole lot of action from the business community around starting to help solve some of these problems. And yeah, and again, I think a lot of that's being driven by now having a common language. Every company, if they don't have some kind of carbon related goal, some kind of net zero related goal, they're getting left behind right now.
mhm,
And yeah, and I think that's driving a lot of action, and it's driving a lot of new attention on this. But there's still a gap in, we're talking about all this, we know what we need to be doing, we generally sort of know how to do it, but we really need some tools and we really need some programs to get
mm,
started. And that's what really excites me about the space that Rheaply's in today, as one of those tools. But we're one of so many other companies that are doing some really really exciting work in this space, and it's going to take all of us working together to make this happen. Not just the kind of solution providers like us, but it's going to take big companies working with big companies in new and innovative ways. It's going to take all of us engaging with that policy element, in very new ways that are that probably aren't traditional, in that space. Um, but yeah, it's going to take a new level of collaboration to make this work, and to and I think we're going there. I want us to see us going there faster. But I think that's ultimately where things are moving.
like it's, I feel like with any systemic issue or big problem that we're facing in the world, we always land on a larger like umbrella collaboration. Like as, we need to
Hmm.
get there. And I
Hmm.
think one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that like not only we became more open to just like new collaborations, we also became faster at it and resourceful at it too. Like we figured like we can collaborate through Zoom. We can collaborate, even if you're in a different country. We can collaborate if you're from different discipline. So I think that openness definitely happened, and I hope that sort of resonates into these other like problems that we're trying to address. Um, because I do agree, it's not one person or body's responsibility, right? This is a shared problem we have that we need to address, and we all have various responsibilities around it. And so, how do we address this together? Um, so, I guess um, for Rheaply, what do you think is coming in the near future, and what do you think you will be working on more?
Mm, I I really want to see us as so if we're talking about built environment as a system with all these different players, all these different kind of inputs and outputs from the system, I want to see Rheaply as the kind of central nervous system of it all. Like I want us to be in a place where we're able to connect those dots and connect those dots at scale. So yeah, so as assets, as materials are kind of moving through that path, we know exactly where it's going to go, we know exactly where it's been, we know exactly where it's headed, and we can start to measure what we're doing, and yeah, and frame that in that common language, whether that's carbon, whether that's landfill diversion, like whatever that needs to be to speak to people and engage with people, and then we can start to frame that as well from that storytelling aspect, and so that's where I see things moving. We've got a couple of really exciting projects right now that are kind of putting us down that pathway, but I want to see a whole lot more of that, and I think that's where we're going. We're headed in some really interesting directions, but we certainly need more inputs into the system. We need more people to work with to get that going.
Well, hopefully it's going to be more and more, and we're excited to follow what's next for Rheaply and the projects that you've been working on once they're, I guess, like live. So I guess as the last piece, I would love to ask for your advice to anyone, and regardless of the industry and the issue that they're trying to address in the world, um, to any progress maker, boundary pusher, creative thinker, what would your advice be?
Ooh, yeah, I'm gonna pull on two of the themes that we've been talking about. So one, look for the stories, like look for the examples around you of things that have been done in very innovative, very unique ways, and start to engage with that. And yeah, and then through that process, start to ask questions of when you don't see it there, when you see things missing. Why is it done this way? Why is my company buying all new desk chairs when we've got a ton of other chairs sitting in storage somewhere? Like, start to question, when it's not happening, and start celebrating when it is. So that would be one kind of piece of advice. And then for people that are coming into this world or starting their career, whether that whatever space that might be in, I think learning about our new common language around carbon, around embodied carbon, and learning what that means in your role, is so critically important. And I remember, going into college, coming out of college, like, everyone was saying, like, oh, learn how to program, learn how to code, like, that's like the one thing that in 10 years everybody's going to be looking for. And today, we could probably say the same thing, but I think we also need to be saying, like, learn about carbon, learn about sustainability. In 10 years, that's going to be the one thing that everybody's looking for.
Mm.
And so that would be my one piece of advice to young folks that are kind of coming into the space today. Learn about carbon, learn about sustainability, and embed that into whatever role it is that you're pursuing.
I love that. I wish I had that advice when I was graduating. I wish everybody had that advice when we were graduating. It wasn't even like, I don't know, in our priority list back then. But better later than never. And I do have great hope in next generation, designers, makers, and definitely, I mean, we've seen the first ever climate strike, right? Like there's definitely much more consciousness and responsibility and anxiety of what, they are inheriting. But I think having examples like yourself and Rheaply is very comforting and creates hope, showing like there are like tools that you can generate to like address these, but also you can work very collaboratively to make it happen. So thank you for all that you do, and thanks so much, Daniel, for making the time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This has been awesome.
Podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.